The smell reached the palace before the news did. Smoke has a way of announcing catastrophe faster than any messenger, and on the day the greatest king Judah had known in generations finally died, it was the smell of burial spices and closed rooms that told the servants something had shifted in the order of the world. King Uzziah, who had reigned for 52 years, who had rebuilt the fortifications of Jerusalem and pushed Judah's borders out toward the sea and the desert, and who had made the nation rich and armed and briefly, dangerously proud, did not die in the palace at all. He died in a house set apart, quarantined from his own people, his skin ruined by a disease that had marked him the moment he overstepped the one boundary even a great king was not permitted to cross. He had walked into the temple himself, censer in hand, to burn incense that only a priest was allowed to burn, and the leprosy had risen on his forehead before he could finish the act. For the remainder of his life, he ruled from behind a wall, his son governing in his place, a king who could see his own city but could no longer walk in it. When he died, the throne passed to Jotham, and the nation exhaled, uncertain whether the exhale was grief or relief, because greatness and shame had lived so closely together in that one long reign that no one could quite untangle which parts of it to mourn. It was in that year, the year the king died, that a young man named Isaiah found himself standing where no living man had any right to stand. He does not tell us how he came to be there. One line only. In the year that King Uzziah died, he saw the Lord. Not a vision of the Lord, not a dream about the Lord, but the Lord himself, seated on a throne high and lifted up, the train of his robe filling the whole temple, until there was no room left in the building for anything else, not for Isaiah's fear, not for Isaiah's doubt, not even for the walls themselves, which seemed to bend and blur under the weight of what they were being asked to contain. Around the throne, creatures unlike anything in the created order, 6 wings apiece, covering their faces because even they could not look directly at what they served, covering their feet because even they were unworthy to stand fully exposed before it, and with the 2 wings that remained, flying. They called to one another across the ringing air of the temple, and their cry was not a description, it was a fact stated 3 times over, because human language has no way to intensify a word except by repeating it. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of heaven's armies. The whole earth is full of his glory. The doorposts shook at the sound. Smoke filled the house, thick as judgment, and Isaiah, a man who had presumably walked into that temple 100 times before as an ordinary worshipper, discovered in that moment that he had never actually seen the place at all. What breaks him is not the throne, and it is not the creatures. It is his own mouth. Woe is me, he says, for I am ruined, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of heaven's armies. There is something almost unbearably specific in that confession. He does not say his heart is unclean, though it surely was, and he does not say his hands are unclean, though they surely were. He names the lips, the instrument of speech, the very tool by which a prophet does his work, because he has understood in an instant that the mouth he is about to be asked to use for divine speech is the same mouth that has told small lies, muttered complaints, joined in the easy cynicism of a nation. He is not condemning Judah from a distance. He includes himself in the indictment before anyone accuses him of anything. This is the detail worth sitting with for a long moment, because every prophet who ever spoke a hard word to his own people first had to hear a harder word spoken over himself. One of the winged creatures does not argue with him. It does not tell him he is wrong to feel unworthy, because he is not wrong. Instead, it flies to the altar, takes a live coal with a pair of tongs, coal still burning from whatever fire had been kept upon that altar for the sacrifices, and touches it to Isaiah's mouth. There is no record that it hurt, though logic says it should have. What the text tells us instead is the result. Your guilt is taken away. Your sin is atoned for. Not earned. Not negotiated. Applied, the way a physician applies a remedy to a wound the patient did not create, and cannot heal on his own. It is worth noticing that Isaiah asked for nothing. He confessed, and the answer came unbidden. A pattern that will recur across the whole of this book like a signature the author cannot help but leave on every page. Judgment and mercy arriving in the same breath, the coal that could have destroyed him instead cleansing him. Only after this does the voice ask its question, and it does not ask Isaiah directly. It asks the room, as though thinking aloud, as though genuinely uncertain who among the assembled host might be willing to carry a message no one particularly wants to hear. Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? And Isaiah, lips still perhaps warm from the coal, says the 5 words that have echoed down every pulpit and every hard calling since. Here am I, send me. He does not ask what the message is before he agrees to carry it. He volunteers blind, which is either the height of faith or the height of foolishness, and the text seems entirely uninterested in making us choose between the two, because perhaps they are the same thing viewed from different distances. The message, when it comes, is not what a young man flushed with mystical experience would want to hear. Go, the voice says, and tell this people. Keep listening, but do not understand. Keep looking, but do not perceive. Make the hearts of this people calloused. Make their ears dull. Close their eyes. Otherwise they might see and hear and understand and turn and be healed. It is one of the strangest commissions in the whole of Scripture. A prophet sent not primarily to produce repentance, but to render a verdict, because the nation has been offered clarity for generations, and has hardened itself against it so consistently that hardening has become, in some terrible sense, the shape of the judgment itself. Isaiah, understandably, asks, How long must I preach to ears that will not hear? How long must this go on? And the answer he receives offers no comfort in the ordinary sense, only scope. Until the cities lie ruined and without inhabitant, until the houses are left deserted, until the fields lie fallow, until the Lord has sent everyone far away, and the land is utterly forsaken. And yet, even inside that bleak horizon, one small clause survives, like a green shoot pushing up through ash. The holy seed will be the stump. Something will remain. Something always remains in this book, buried under the wreckage of everything that does not. To understand why this commission mattered, and why it would matter for the better part of 2 centuries, it helps to understand exactly what kind of nation Isaiah had just been sent to address. Judah in that generation was small, wedged between larger powers, still nominally independent, but never more than one bad alliance away from irrelevance or ruin. To the north sat the sister kingdom of Israel, torn from Judah generations earlier in a bitter division that had never healed, ruled by a rotating caste of kings who rarely lasted a full generation on the throne before assassination or war removed them. Beyond both kingdoms, growing larger and hungrier with each passing decade, sat Assyria, an empire that did not simply conquer territory, but rearrange the populations within it, deporting whole peoples and replacing them with others, erasing not just governments, but identities. Judah, under Uzziah, had enjoyed a rare season of prosperity and expanded borders, wealth that bred both confidence and complacency, a temple full of ritual and a marketplace full of injustice, existing side by side as though the two had nothing to do with each other. It is this exact contradiction, worship without righteousness, sacrifice without mercy, that the opening oracles of this book will spend their fury exposing long before Isaiah ever climbs the steps of the temple to receive his vision. There is a detail easy to miss in the account of Uzziah's death that deserves a second look, because it explains why the vision that follows lands with such force. For 52 years, an entire generation of Judah had known no other king. Men who were newborns when Uzziah took the throne were now grown with sons of their own, and they had never once had to imagine the nation under anyone else. Security of that kind, security that stretches across a whole lifetime, has a way of quietly convincing a people that the order of things is permanent, that the walls will always stand because they have always stood, that the harvests will always come because they have always come. Uzziah himself seems to have fallen into exactly that trap in his final years, walking into the temple as though decades of victories had earned him the right to cross a line that had never belonged to kings in the first place. His disgrace, spent behind a quarantine wall while his own son ruled in his stead, was a small and personal preview of a much larger disgrace that would eventually fall on the whole nation for the same essential sin: the conviction that blessing could be enjoyed indefinitely while the terms attached to that blessing were quietly ignored. When Isaiah says he lives among a people of unclean lips, he is not being poetic. He is describing a court and a capital that had spent 2 generations growing fat and self-assured, while the widow, the orphan, and the poor of the land were left to fend for themselves against judges who could be bought and merchants who diluted their measures. The prophet's guilt, and the nation's guilt beside it, had been accumulating quietly for years before that particular afternoon in the temple gave it a name. It is also worth pausing on the strange comfort embedded in the timing of the vision. The death of a king was, in the ancient world, one of the most dangerous moments a nation could pass through, a gap in the chain of authority in which rival claimants, foreign powers, and internal factions all sensed opportunity at once. That Isaiah was given his commission in precisely that gap, in the very year the throne stood most exposed, suggests that the vision was never meant only for him. It was a message smuggled into the collective anxiety of an entire capital city grieving a dead king and bracing for whatever came next. The Lord Isaiah saw, seated high and lifted up, was, in effect, a direct answer to that anxiety. An image deliberately placed beside the empty throne of Judah to insist that thrones may fall silent and kings may die behind quarantine walls. But the throne that actually governs the world had never for one moment been vacant and never would be. That then is the world into which the coal touched a man's lips, and a voice asked its question into an empty room that was somehow also entirely full. A dead king, disgraced by his own pride. A living king about to inherit both a treasury and a crisis he did not yet see coming. A prophet cleansed but not comforted, commissioned to speak into ears that had already begun closing themselves before he ever opened his mouth. Nothing about this beginning promised success. Everything about it promised endurance, which, as the rest of this story will show, is very often the harder and rarer gift of the two. Jotham did not last long on the throne his father had vacated, and when he died the crown passed to his son Ahaz, a young man who inherited a kingdom already trembling before he had ruled a single full year. It is difficult to find a king anywhere in this account who is judged more plainly than Ahaz, and the judgment is not for cruelty in the ordinary sense, nor for laziness, nor even for outright rebellion against the God his fathers had worshipped. It is for something quieter and, in its way, more dangerous: fear dressed up as pragmatism. Ahaz looked at the threats gathering on his northern border and made a series of decisions that felt, to him, like the only sensible choices available to a small king in an impossible position. History would remember them as the moment Judah traded its inheritance for a treaty and traded a treaty for a master. The threat itself had a name, or rather, 2 names joined together, because it came from 2 kings acting as one. Rezin, king of the Arameans in Damascus, and Pekah, king of the northern kingdom of Israel, had formed an alliance aimed squarely at Jerusalem. Their reasoning was simple enough on the surface. Assyria, the empire rising in the east with an appetite that seemed to have no upper limit, had begun demanding tribute from every smaller kingdom within its reach, and Rezin and Pekah had concluded that the only way to resist that pressure was to build a coalition strong enough to stand against it. Judah, sitting stubbornly outside their alliance, was seen not as a neutral party, but as a liability, a weak link that Assyria might exploit or that might simply refuse to contribute its share to a common defense. So the 2 kings marched south together, intending not merely to intimidate Ahaz, but to remove him from his throne entirely and replace him with a puppet of their own choosing, a man identified only by his father's name, Tabeel, a nobody plucked from obscurity for the sole purpose of being pliable. News of the alliance reached the house of David, as the text pointedly calls it, and the reaction was not the reaction of a king trusting in ancient promises. The account says plainly that the heart of Ahaz and the hearts of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. It is a small detail, easy to read past, but it carries enormous weight because trees do not choose to shake. They are acted upon entirely by a force outside themselves, helpless, bending whichever way the gust decides. That is precisely the condition Ahaz found himself in, a king ruled by his fear rather than ruling through it, and it is into that exact condition that Isaiah is sent to meet him. The meeting itself takes place at a location the text bothers to specify with unusual precision, the end of the conduit of the upper pool, on the road to the launderer's field, as though the writer wanted later generations to be able to walk the exact ground where this conversation happened. Ahaz was there, according to the most reasonable reading of events, inspecting the city's water supply, making the sort of practical preparations any competent king would make before an anticipated siege. There is nothing wrong, on its face, with checking one's water supply. The trouble is what such preparation reveals about where a king's confidence has come to rest. Isaiah meets him there, deliberately, and brings with him his own son, a boy whose very name was a walking sermon, Shear Jashub, meaning a remnant shall return. Before a single word of prophecy is spoken, the prophet has already brought a visual argument with him, a living reminder that even in catastrophe something always survives. The message Isaiah carries is almost absurdly simple in its content and almost impossibly difficult in what it demands. Be careful. Keep calm. Do not be afraid. Do not lose heart because of these two smoldering stubs of firewood, the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram and the son of Remaliah. The imagery is deliberately, almost insultingly deflating. Two kings who felt to Ahaz like an inescapable storm are reduced by the prophet to two burnt-out sticks, still smoking, capable of nothing more than irritation, incapable of the destruction they threatened. Isaiah goes further, predicting that within a fixed span of years, 65 in total, Israel's own kingdom would be so thoroughly broken that it would cease to exist as a coherent people at all. The counsel underneath all of it is not military strategy. It is a single theological claim, stated almost as a proverb. If you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. The play on words in the original language is lost in translation, but not in meaning. Standing and believing are, in this moment, functionally the same act. Then comes the offer that any king in his right mind should have seized without hesitation. Ask a sign of the Lord your God, Isaiah tells him. Ask it in the depth or in the height above. It is an extraordinarily generous invitation, open-ended in a way that almost nothing else in this book will be, an offer to prove the prophet's word through whatever confirmation Ahaz might require, no matter how extravagant. And Ahaz refuses. His refusal is dressed in the language of piety. I will not ask, neither will I test the Lord, borrowing the very words Israel had once used to describe the sin of testing God in the wilderness, as though declining the offer were itself an act of reverence. But the reader who has followed the story this far can see the refusal for what it actually is. Ahaz has already made his decision. He has already sent messengers to the king of Assyria, offering himself as a servant and a son in exchange for rescue from Rezin and Pekah, stripping the temple and his own palace of silver and gold to pay for the privilege of being conquered slowly rather than quickly. A sign from the Lord would have been an inconvenience to a king who had already chosen his Savior and chosen it from Nineveh rather than from Zion. It is at precisely this point, with the king's refusal hanging in the air, that Isaiah stops addressing Ahaz alone and turns instead to the house of David as a whole, because what is about to be said no longer belongs merely to one frightened man's crisis. Hear now, house of David, is it too small a thing for you to weary men, that you weary my God also? The sign will be given whether the king wants it or not, because the promise underneath it was never really about Ahaz's particular war. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Immanuel, God with us. Scholars across many centuries have argued over how much of this sign was meant to be fulfilled immediately. In the birth of a child within Isaiah's own lifetime, whose growth would mark the timeline of Judah's deliverance from the two kings threatening it, and how much of it reached forward across 700 years to a birth in a small town that the original hearers could not possibly have imagined in any detail. The text itself seems entirely comfortable holding both meanings at once, refusing to resolve the tension for us, and perhaps that comfort with mystery is itself part of the message. A sign is not required to explain itself completely the moment it is given. It is required only to be true when its time finally comes. The oracle that follows the naming of the child is not comforting in any simple sense. Isaiah describes a coming devastation. Curds and honey shall the child eat, a description that sounds pastoral, until it is understood as a description of a land so thoroughly ruined that its cultivated fields will have reverted to a wilderness stark enough that its only produce is what wild bees and untended herds happen to leave behind. The very King Ahaz has just hired as his rescuer will, in the fullness of time, become the razor Isaiah describes, shaving Judah clean, beard and all, an image of humiliation so total and so intimate that no listener could have mistaken its meaning. The Assyrian alliance Ahaz purchased at the cost of his own faith would not remain a rescue. It would become, in time, a debt collector, and then an occupier. And the very throne room Ahaz was so anxious to protect would end up paying tribute to the empire he had invited in to save it. What makes this whole episode so painful to read is not that Ahaz made an obviously foolish choice in the moment. Every calculation available to him, every report from his scouts, every anxious voice in his court argued that Assyria was the rational answer and faith was a luxury a small kingdom under siege could not afford. That is precisely the point the account seems most determined to make. The choice between fear and faith rarely presents itself as a choice between the sensible and the absurd. It presents itself as a choice between what can be measured and what must simply be trusted, and Ahaz, given every opportunity to ask for proof, chose instead to trust what he could already see, an army marching south under a foreign banner, rather than a promise spoken by a prophet standing at a laundry field beside a water conduit. The child would be born. The sign would stand, whether or not the king who first heard it ever came to believe it. But a sign given to one frightened king in one small city was never going to be the whole of what Isaiah had to say, because the God who had filled the temple with the train of his robe was not, in this prophet's telling, a local deity concerned only with the affairs of Judah. He was described as ruling over every throne on earth, whether that throne acknowledged him or not, and so the oracles that follow the Immanuel prophecy widen out, chapter after chapter, into a long procession of foreign courts and foreign gods and foreign fears, each nation summoned in turn to hear a verdict it had never asked for and would almost certainly never read. It is one of the strangest features of this book that so much of it is addressed to people who were never going to be in the room. Isaiah did not travel to Babylon to deliver his oracle against Babylon. He did not sail to Tyre. These pronouncements were spoken in Jerusalem, written down in Jerusalem, and preserved by a people who were themselves often the intended audience, even when the words on the page were aimed elsewhere. because watching how God dealt with the pride of other nations was itself meant to instruct Judah in how carefully its own pride was being weighed on the same scale. The first and heaviest of these burdens falls on Babylon, which is a curious choice given that at the time these words were first spoken, Babylon was not yet the empire that would one day burn Jerusalem to the ground. It existed in Isaiah's own lifetime as a resentful vassal chafing under Assyrian control, ambitious but not yet dominant, a city more likely to be crushed by Nineveh than to crush anyone else. And yet the oracle describes its future fall with a specificity that reads less like forecasting and more like memory written in advance. A great army gathering on a bare hilltop, a noise on the mountains like that of a huge army, nations massing together from a distant land, from the end of the heavens, the weapons of God's indignation to destroy the whole country. The proud city that would one day boast that it would sit as queen forever, that would say in its heart, "I am, and there is none besides me," is promised a humiliation that will strip away every layer of its self-image at once. Widowhood and loss of children coming upon her in full measure in a single day. Wild goats will dance on its ruins, the oracle says. Jackals will cry in its palaces, and the very name Babylon, once synonymous with grandeur, will become nothing more than a byword for desolation, a place no traveling shepherd will ever again pitch his tent. Buried inside this oracle against Babylon is one of the most arresting passages in the entire book, a taunt song aimed not merely at a city, but at whatever proud king happened to be sitting on its throne when the final collapse arrived. "How you have fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn," the taunt begins, describing a figure who had said in his heart, "I will ascend to heaven, I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will make myself like the Most High, only to be brought down instead to the realm of the dead, to the depths of the pit." Generations of readers, both Jewish and Christian, have heard in this taunt an echo reaching far beyond any single Babylonian tyrant, a description of pride itself in its purest and most cosmic form, the ambition to occupy the place that belongs to God alone. Whatever else the passage means, its placement here is deliberate. Every empire that has ever convinced itself of its own permanence is being addressed at once through the specific and temporary figure of one doomed king. From Babylon the oracles turn to Assyria itself, the empire whose shadow lay over every other nation in this section, and here the tone shifts in an important way. Assyria is described not as an independent villain acting purely out of its own malice, but as a tool. The rod of my anger, the staff in their hands is my fury, an instrument God himself had raised up to discipline a godless nation and to plunder a people who provoked him. And yet the tool is warned that it will not escape judgment, simply because it served a purpose. Does the axe boast over the one who swings it? The oracle asks. Does the saw exalt itself above the one who wields it? Assyria's cruelty had exceeded its mandate, its king boasting in his own heart of the cities he had toppled as though his own strength alone had accomplished it, forgetting entirely whose hand had actually moved him. And so the same empire God had used to correct Judah and to erase the northern kingdom entirely is promised its own eventual reckoning, its vast army to be consumed as a sickness consumes a strong man's body, its glorious forest and fruitful fields to be so thoroughly ruined that a child could count what remained. Moab receives an oracle heavy with something closer to grief than condemnation, a rare tenderness surfacing in the middle of judgment. Ar of Moab is destroyed in a night, the passage begins, and continues through a catalogue of cities weeping, of fugitives fleeing with whatever they can carry, of a nation whose wailing rises even from its own idol temples because the gods it had trusted have proven as helpless as the people who served them. And then, almost without warning, the prophetic voice breaks in with an admission rarely offered anywhere else in this collection of oracles. Therefore, my heart cries out for Moab like a harp, my inmost being for Kir of Moab. It is a striking detail, this willingness to mourn even the fall of a nation that had, by most other accounts in Scripture, been no particular friend to Judah. Judgment in this book is never once described as something delivered with satisfaction. It is delivered again and again with something closer to sorrow. Damascus and the northern kingdom of Israel are joined together in a single oracle, a pairing that makes sense given how tightly their fates had been bound since the days of Rezin and Pekah's failed alliance against Ahaz. The oracle predicts that Damascus will cease to be a city and become instead a heap of ruins, and that the glory of Jacob, meaning the glory of Israel's own kingdom, will grow thin, its fatness turning to leanness, comparing the coming devastation to a field so thoroughly harvested that only a few stray heads of grain remain on its edges, or an olive tree so completely stripped that 2 or 3 olives are left clinging to its topmost branches. In that image of gleanings, of scattered remnants left behind after a harvest, the oracle offers the same quiet promise that has threaded through every judgment so far, that total destruction and complete disappearance are not, in this book, quite the same thing. Egypt receives one of the longer and more surprising oracles in the entire sequence. Surprising because it does not end where oracles against foreign powers usually end. The passage opens with the customary description of chaos, the idols of Egypt trembling, its spirit failing within it, its people fighting neighbor against neighbor and city against city, its wise counselors giving foolish advice, its rivers running dry and its industries collapsing for lack of water. But then the oracle turns, describing a day when Egypt itself will worship the God of Israel, when an altar will stand in the middle of that land, when the Lord will make himself known to the Egyptians, and they, along with Assyria, will be joined together with Israel as a blessing in the midst of the earth, 3 ancient enemies bound together in the same covenant, the Lord of heaven's armies calling Egypt my people, Assyria the work of my hands, and Israel my inheritance. It is one of the boldest visions in the whole of this book, a promise that the same nations currently marked out for judgment will one day be marked out just as thoroughly for inclusion. Tyre closes this long procession, and its oracle carries a particular sting because Tyre's offense was neither cruelty nor idolatry in any dramatic sense, but simple commercial arrogance. A city that had made itself wealthy on the strength of its trading fleets, and had come to imagine that its wealth was permanent, its harbor a source of endless profit for merchants and kings alike. The oracle describes the wailing of ships returning home to find their harbor gone, the humiliation of a city once called the bestower of crowns, whose traders were princes and whose merchants were honored throughout the earth, brought low simply to prove, the text says, that the Lord of heaven's armies planned to defile the pride of all glory and to humble all who are renowned on the earth. And yet even Tyre's judgment is not final. The oracle describes the city eventually returning to its old profession after 70 years, its profits and hire this time consecrated to the Lord, dedicated to those who live in his presence, feeding them well and clothing them richly. The very wealth that had once fed only pride, finally repurposed for something worth keeping. Read together. This long chain of oracles against Babylon, Assyria, Moab, Damascus, Egypt, and Tyre forms something closer to a courtroom than a travelogue, each nation summoned in its turn, its particular pride examined, its particular judgment pronounced, and in nearly every case a thread of mercy left dangling somewhere inside the sentence. No empire in this section is described as too proud to eventually be humbled. No empire is described as too far gone to eventually be redeemed. What emerges across the whole sequence is a portrait of a God who claims authority over every throne on earth simultaneously, who weighs a Babylonian king's ambition on the same scale as an Egyptian pharaoh's, who mourns even the collapse of nations that had never once honored him, and who seems entirely unwilling to let any single act of judgment be the last word spoken over anyone. It is a sweeping vision, and it is also, quietly, a warning aimed back at the very city where these words were first written down, because a people who had just watched their prophet catalog the pride of 6 foreign powers were being invited, whether they noticed it or not, to examine the same pride sitting comfortably in their own palace. Ahaz died, still owing tribute to the empire he had begged for rescue, and the throne passed to his son Hezekiah, a king the record treats with a warmth it extends to almost no one else in this entire account. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, the chronicler says, just as his ancestor David had done, and then goes further than that simple formula usually goes, adding that there was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before him or after him. He tore down the high places his father and grandfather had tolerated, smashed the sacred stones, cut down the Asherah poles, and even destroyed a bronze serpent that Moses himself had once made in the wilderness, because the people had begun burning incense to it, as though the object itself carried power rather than the God who had once used it. It was, by any measure available to the writers of this account, a reformation as thorough as any Judah would ever see, and it came at almost exactly the moment the kingdom needed every ounce of spiritual clarity it could gather, because the empire that had once been Ahaz's rescuer was about to become everyone's executioner. The northern kingdom fell first, and its fall was not sudden. Samaria had provoked Assyria for years, first through the failed alliance with Damascus against Judah, then through a series of increasingly desperate attempts to play larger powers against one another, appealing at one point to Egypt for help that never fully materialized. Shalmaneser laid siege to the city, and when the dust settled under his successor, the northern kingdom that had once stood as Judah's sister nation, torn from the same house of David generations earlier, simply ceased to exist as a coherent people. Its population was deported wholesale, scattered among distant provinces of the empire in the exact manner Assyria had perfected, a strategy designed not merely to conquer but to dissolve, to break the link between a people and its land so completely that return became not just difficult, but conceptually impossible. Foreign settlers were brought in to replace them, and the 10 tribes that had made up that kingdom passed into a kind of historical fog from which they would never fully re-emerge, remembered ever after simply as the lost tribes, a phrase that carries in it both an ocean of grief and the finality of an experiment that would not be repeated in quite the same way. Judah watched all of this happen from a position of terrified proximity, and for a time Hezekiah, like his father before him, seems to have believed that the safest path forward lay in careful diplomacy rather than open defiance. But Hezekiah's diplomacy eventually curdled into rebellion. When Sargon's successor, Sennacherib, came to Assyria's throne, Hezekiah judged the moment right to withhold the tribute his father had promised, strengthening Jerusalem's defenses, reinforcing the broken sections of its wall, building a second wall around the weakest parts of the city, and famously commissioning a tunnel to be cut directly through solid rock, so that the waters of the Gihon spring could be channeled safely inside the city walls, denying any future besieger the easy victory of simply cutting off Jerusalem's water. It was, in purely practical terms, an impressive piece of engineering and an impressive piece of statecraft. It was also, in the eyes of an empire that had just finished erasing an entire neighboring kingdom, an open provocation that could not go unanswered. Sennacherib's response came with the full and deliberate weight of imperial machinery. His armies swept down through Judah's countryside, and the record states with blunt specificity that he captured 46 of Judah's fortified cities, along with the surrounding villages, a number meant to convey not exaggeration, but simply the scale of a systematic campaign that left almost nothing standing between the empire's advancing columns and Jerusalem itself. Lachish, one of the most heavily fortified cities in the kingdom, fell after a siege so significant that Sennacherib would later have its conquest carved in detail across the walls of his own palace, a boast meant to be read by anyone who ever doubted the reach of Assyrian power. With his southern flank secured and his reputation for annihilation already well established, Sennacherib turned his attention to Jerusalem, and Hezekiah, watching his kingdom collapse city by city, sent a message of surrender before the siege had even fully closed around the capital, offering whatever tribute the Assyrian king demanded. Sennacherib named his price, an enormous weight of silver and gold, and Hezekiah paid it in full, stripping the temple doors and doorposts of their gold overlay to meet the sum. It did not end the crisis. Whether Sennacherib had never intended the payment to satisfy him, or whether some other provocation reignited his anger, his forces returned to Jerusalem's gates anyway, and this time he sent not silver merchants, but a field commander whose entire assignment was psychological warfare. Standing where every soldier on Jerusalem's wall could hear him, speaking deliberately in the language of the common people rather than the diplomatic tongue reserved for negotiations between officials, the field commander mocked Hezekiah's confidence directly, asking on what basis Judah's king dared to trust in anything at all, reminding the listening crowd that Egypt, the ally some in Jerusalem had hoped might yet intervene, was nothing more than a splintered reed that would pierce the hand of anyone foolish enough to lean on it. He went further still, claiming that Hezekiah's own religious reforms, the tearing down of high places and altars throughout the countryside, had actually offended the very God Hezekiah claimed to trust, an argument crafted with real cunning, twisting genuine covenant faithfulness into an apparent act of impiety. And then, most dangerously of all, he claimed that his own campaign carried divine sanction, that the Lord himself had told him to march against this land and destroy it, a claim designed to sever the last thread connecting Jerusalem's defenders to any confidence that their God might still be fighting on their side. The officials standing on the wall begged the commander to speak in the diplomatic language rather than the common tongue, precisely because they understood what he was doing, aiming his words not at the king's negotiators, but directly at the ordinary soldiers and citizens who could hear every syllable from where they stood. He refused, and raised his voice further, warning the people not to let Hezekiah deceive them, listing off a catalog of nations whose gods had proven powerless against Assyria, Hamath and Arpad, Sepharvaim, Hena and Ivvah, asking pointedly where those gods had been when their cities fell, and demanding to know what made Jerusalem's God any different from the rest. Hezekiah's response to this speech is one of the most human moments in the entire account. He tore his clothes, covered himself in sackcloth, and went into the temple. And then he did something that separates this crisis from nearly every other crisis in this book. He sent for the prophet. Word came back from Isaiah almost immediately, and it carried none of the ambiguity that had characterized so many earlier oracles. "Do not be afraid of the words you have heard," the message said, "the very words with which servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me." The Assyrian king would hear a rumor, the prophecy continued, and would return to his own land, where he would fall by the sword. It was a promise offered without qualification, remarkable given how thoroughly every other kingdom summoned in the earlier oracles had been humbled precisely because it trusted too easily in its own strength. Sennacherib, before withdrawing, sent one final letter, And Hezekiah's response to that letter says as much about the turning point of this whole crisis as anything spoken by the prophet. He took the letter, walked up to the temple, and spread it out before the Lord, praying not for personal deliverance in the abstract, but for something far more pointed, that all the kingdoms of the earth might know that the Lord alone is God. The siege that had begun as a matter of tribute and territory had, by the time it reached its climax, become a referendum on whether the God of a small and battered kingdom could stand against the God-king ambitions of the greatest empire the region had yet produced. Whatever happened next would settle that question in view of every nation whose gods had already fallen silent before the same advancing army. The answer came in the night, and it came without a single Judean sword being drawn. The account states it as plainly as it states anything in this entire narrative, that the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 men in the Assyrian camp. And when the survivors rose at dawn, they found the ground around them covered with the dead. There is no description of battle, no account of siege engines breached or walls defended, only the sudden and total silence of an army that had, the night before, been mocking the very idea that Jerusalem's God could do anything at all. Sennacherib broke camp and returned to Nineveh, the capital he had left in such confidence, and there, some time later, while he was worshiping in the temple of his own God, his own sons struck him down with the sword and escaped into the land of Ararat, leaving another son to inherit a throne his father had disgraced in the very city where he had gone to give thanks. The empire that had erased the northern kingdom without difficulty, that had swallowed 46 of Judah's fortified cities in a single campaign, had been stopped at the one gate it could not force open, and stopped in a manner that left no room for any general to claim the credit. It would be a comforting place to end the story of Hezekiah, a faithful king rewarded with a spectacular deliverance, and in a sense, the account does treat it as exactly that kind of climax. But the writer is not finished with Hezekiah, and what follows complicates the portrait of this otherwise exemplary king in ways that are easy to overlook if the reader is only looking for tidy conclusions. In those days, the text says, placing the event either just before or very near the same span of time as the siege itself, Hezekiah became sick and was at the point of death. Isaiah came to him with a message carrying none of the comfort the king might have expected after everything he had just witnessed. "Put your house in order," the prophet told him, "because you are going to die, you will not recover." It is worth pausing on how stark that sentence is. Delivered without softening, without qualification, to a king the chronicler has just finished praising above every other king before or after him. Hezekiah's response was not resignation. He turned his face to the wall, away from the prophet, away from the attendants surely standing nearby, and prayed, reminding the Lord, in words that sound almost like an appeal to a contract rather than a simple plea for mercy, how faithfully and wholeheartedly he had walked before him and done what was good in his sight. Then he wept, and the weeping seems to have mattered as much as the argument, because Isaiah had barely left the palace, had not yet crossed the middle court according to one telling of the event, before the word of the Lord came back to him and sent him straight back to the king. "I have heard your prayer," the message said. "I have seen your tears, I will heal you, and on the 3rd day from now you will go up to the house of the Lord." 15 years were added to his life, a specific and generous number, along with a further promise that the very city Sennacherib had so recently threatened would be delivered out of the hand of the Assyrian king and defended for the sake of both the Lord's own reputation and the memory of David his servant. Hezekiah, weakened as he was, seems to have wanted more than a spoken promise, and Isaiah, remarkably, allowed him to ask for one, the same generous offer that had once been extended to Ahaz and refused. "What is the sign that I will go up to the house of the Lord?" Hezekiah asked, and Isaiah gave him a choice with almost theatrical flexibility built into it. Whether the shadow on the palace stairway constructed by his father Ahaz should move forward 10 steps in its ordinary course, which even the king recognized would be the easy thing to ask, or move backward 10 steps instead, which would mean reversing something no human mechanism could reverse. Hezekiah chose the harder sign, and the shadow moved back the 10 steps it had already descended, an event so unusual that later tradition would remember it as one of the most striking wonders in the whole reign. A small mechanical shadow bending backward against the plain motion of the sun to confirm a promise about 15 added years of a single man's life. It is a strange, almost intimate miracle compared to the mass deliverance of the city only a short time before, and its very strangeness seems to underline something this book keeps returning to, that the God who moves entire empires is equally willing to move the shadow on a staircase for the sake of one frightened man's tears. Recovered, and evidently proud of both his recovery and his deliverance, Hezekiah made a decision that the text treats with unmistakable disapproval, though it takes its time revealing why. Word of his illness and his recovery had traveled far enough to reach Babylon and Merodach-Baladan, a king who ruled there and who had his own long history of stirring rebellion against Assyria whenever the opportunity presented itself, sent envoys to Jerusalem bearing letters and a gift, ostensibly to congratulate Hezekiah on his return to health. Hezekiah welcomed them with an openness that reads, on a second pass, as something closer to vanity than hospitality. He showed them everything, the account says, everything in his storehouses, the silver and the gold, the spices and the fine oil, the whole of his armory and everything found in his treasuries, so that there was nothing in his palace or in all his kingdom that Hezekiah did not show them. There is no record that these envoys asked to see any of it. The showing appears to have been entirely the king's own initiative, a display offered freely to men who had traveled from the very empire whose ambitions would, within a few generations, prove more dangerous to Judah than Assyria had ever been. Isaiah's question, when he came to the king afterward, was pointed in a way that suggests the prophet already knew the answer before he asked it. What did these men say, and where did they come from? Hezekiah answered honestly, they came from a distant country, from Babylon. What did they see in your palace? Isaiah pressed further, and Hezekiah, apparently still untroubled, answered that they had seen everything, that there was nothing among his treasures he had not shown them. The judgment that followed came without theatrics, delivered as simply as a fact already decided. The days are coming, Isaiah told him, when everything in your palace and all that your predecessors have stored up until this day will be carried off to Babylon, nothing will be left, and some of your own descendants, your own flesh and blood, will be taken away to serve as eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Hezekiah's reaction to this pronouncement is one of the more uncomfortable moments in the entire book, precisely because of how easily it could be misread as simple relief. The word of the Lord you have spoken is good, he told Isaiah, and then added a private thought that has troubled readers ever since. Will there not be peace and security in my lifetime? It is a response that has been read charitably by some, as a king humbly accepting a judgment he knows he deserves, while quietly grateful the full weight of it will fall on a generation not yet born, and read far less charitably by others, as a small, self-interested comfort taken by a man who had just been told that his own house, his own bloodline, would eventually be led away in chains, and whose first thought was apparently for his own remaining years, rather than for the descendants who would inherit the catastrophe. The text itself declines to resolve which reading is correct, offering neither praise nor further rebuke, simply letting the king's words hang in the air the way so many words in this book are left to hang, unresolved, waiting for a future generation to discover exactly how heavy they truly were. What makes this whole episode essential to the larger shape of the story is how precisely it plants, in the middle of Judah's greatest deliverance, the seed of its ultimate catastrophe. Assyria, the empire that had seemed poised to swallow Jerusalem whole, had just been turned back at the gate by a single night's visitation. But the account refuses to let that victory stand as the final word, insisting instead that the true danger to this kingdom was never only external. A king who could weep with such evident sincerity over his own mortality, who could pray with such intimate confidence that his tears were heard, could also, within the very same reign, display his treasuries to foreign envoys with a carelessness that would cost his descendants everything. Assyria's threat had been visible, loud, and standing at the gate with siege engines. Babylon's threat, planted quietly in a moment of vanity dressed as hospitality, would prove far more patient and far more final. Between the prophecy Isaiah spoke to Hezekiah about a distant exile and the moment that exile actually arrived, more than a full century would pass, a stretch of time long enough that everyone who heard the original warning would be long dead before it came true, and their children after them, and, in most cases, their children's children as well. Kings would rise and fall in Jerusalem during that gap, some faithful, most not, and the warnings Isaiah had spoken against pride and injustice would go largely unheeded by a nation that had watched Assyria turned back at its gates and had drawn from that deliverance precisely the wrong lesson that its own God could always be relied upon to protect it, no matter how far its own conduct drifted from what that God actually required. Babylon, meanwhile, did exactly what Isaiah had described in his earlier oracle against it, rising from a resentful vassal to the dominant power in the region, eventually marching against Jerusalem itself, breaking down its walls, burning its temple, and carrying off the very treasures Hezekiah had once so proudly displayed, along with a great many of his own descendants, into the exile the prophet had named so precisely so long before. It is at this point, with the exile already a settled and bitter fact, rather than a distant warning, that the book undergoes the most dramatic shift in its entire sweep, a change so pronounced that it feels, on first reading, almost like the beginning of an entirely different work. The oracles of judgment that had dominated everything before this point give way, almost without transition, to a voice speaking not threat but consolation, not accusation but tenderness, opening with a command repeated twice for emphasis, "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God." "Speak tenderly to Jerusalem," the voice continues, "and proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed, that her sin has been paid for, that she has received from the hand of the Lord double for all her sins." Whatever debt the earlier oracles had described as accumulating across generations of injustice and idolatry is here declared settled, not through Jerusalem's own effort, but through a sentence already served, a exile already endured, a punishment the text treats as sufficient and complete. A voice cries out. The passage continues, "In the wilderness prepare the way for the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low, the rough ground shall become level, the rugged places a plain." And then, in words that will echo across centuries of later readers, far beyond the original audience huddled in exile, "The glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all people will see it together." It is an image drawn from the practice of preparing a royal road for the arrival of a king, engineers leveling obstacles and smoothing the path long before the monarch himself ever sets foot on it. And here, that entire apparatus of preparation is turned toward the arrival not of any earthly ruler, but of God himself, coming to gather and lead home a people who had assumed, after so many years in a foreign land, that they had been forgotten entirely. Against the despair that clearly still gripped many of the exiles, this section of the book mounts one of the most sustained arguments anywhere in Scripture for the sheer, incomparable scale of the God who is making these promises. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, the passage asks, or with the breadth of his hand marked off the heavens? Who has held the dust of the earth in a basket, or weighed the mountains on the scales and the hills in a balance? The nations, by comparison, are described as a drop in a bucket, regarded as dust on the scales, so light that entire islands seem to float away at his touch. Lift up your eyes and look to the heavens, the passage urges. Who created all these? He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls forth each of them by name. And because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. It is against this backdrop of cosmic scale that the exiles' own complaint is finally addressed directly. Their claim that their way is hidden from the Lord, that their cause has been disregarded by their God. Do you not know? The passage answers. Have you not heard? The everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth, will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall, but those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. Alongside this argument for scale runs a second argument, aimed with unmistakable precision at the idols the exiles saw all around them in Babylon, statues carried in elaborate processions through the city streets, gods that had to be nailed down so they would not topple, gods whose worshippers had to carry them rather than being carried by them. The passage mocks these idols with a specific, almost workshop-level detail, describing a craftsman encouraging a goldsmith, a metalworker overlaying an image with gold and casting silver chains for it, a man too poor for such an idol, instead choosing wood that will not rot, and looking for a skilled worker to set up a false god that will not topple, an image that must be fastened with nails so that it will not fall over. Contrasted against this manufactured helplessness is the God who declares the end from the beginning, from ancient times what is still to come, who says, "My purpose will stand, and I will do all that I please." It is in this same argumentative sweep that a challenge is issued directly to the idols and to whatever powers stand behind them. Present your case, the passage demands. Set forth your arguments. Tell us what is going to happen, so we may know that you are gods. Do something, whether good or bad, so that we will be dismayed and filled with fear. An invitation, the text seems fully confident, will never be answered. It is inside this argument about a God who declares the end from the beginning that one of the most startling names in the entire book appears, spoken generations before the man himself would be born. Cyrus is named directly, called my shepherd, who will accomplish all that I please. He will say of Jerusalem, "Let it be rebuilt," and of the temple, "Let its foundations be laid." The passage goes further still, calling Cyrus the Lord's anointed, a title elsewhere in Scripture reserved almost exclusively for Israel's own kings and priests, here extended without apparent hesitation to a pagan Persian ruler who, by the time these events actually unfolded, would indeed conquer Babylon, and would indeed issue a decree permitting the exiled peoples under his new empire, including the Jewish exiles, to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples at his own expense. "I will go before you. The promise to Cyrus continues, "And will level the mountains. I will break down gates of bronze and cut through bars of iron. I will give you hidden treasures, riches stored in secret places, so that you may know that I am the Lord, the God of Israel, who summons you by name." And then, in words that make the whole passage's purpose unmistakable, the reason for this extraordinary elevation of a foreign king is stated plainly: "For the sake of Jacob my servant, of Israel my chosen, I summon you by name and bestow on you a title of honor, though you do not acknowledge me." Cyrus himself, in the world these prophecies describe, would never come to know the God who had named him so far in advance. He was being used, precisely as Assyria had once been used, as an instrument whose own motives were entirely beside the point compared to the purpose being accomplished through him. Babylon's own fall is described in this section with a bitterness that mirrors, almost exactly, the earlier taunt song aimed at the fallen morning star. The proud city commanded now to sit in the dust, to take millstones and grind flour, to remove her veil, strip off her robe, bare her legs and wade through the streams, her nakedness exposed and her shame uncovered. The very sorceries and many enchantments she had labored over since her youth are described as utterly useless to save her, and the astrologers she consulted month after month are mocked, as unable even to save themselves from the flames about to consume them. It is a hard passage, and it is placed deliberately beside the tenderness of comfort. Comfort my people, because the two are not, in the logic of this book, in any real tension with each other. The same act that finally humbles the empire which had crushed Jerusalem is the very act that sets Jerusalem's own people free to go home. What makes this whole turn from judgment to comfort so remarkable is how little of it depends on anything the exiles themselves had done to deserve it. Every earlier oracle in this book had linked catastrophe tightly to conduct. Pride punished, injustice exposed, idolatry judged. But the announcement of comfort arrives instead as something closer to pure gift, a declaration that the debt has already been paid, that the shepherd who will bring them home has already been named, though he does not yet know it himself, that the God who measures oceans in the hollow of his hand has not for one moment forgotten a people who assumed, in the long grinding years of exile, that they had been forgotten completely. Woven through this long section of comfort and promised return is a figure who appears and disappears across 4 distinct passages, never given a proper name, referred to simply as the servant, and whose identity has occupied readers for so many centuries that entire libraries could be filled with the arguments over who exactly he was meant to be. At times, the servant is described in terms that seem to apply directly to the nation of Israel itself, called by name in the very same breath, Israel, my servant, whom I have chosen. At other times, the servant is described as doing something Israel as a whole is elsewhere said to have failed at entirely, restoring Israel, bringing Jacob back to God, a task that would make little sense if the servant and the nation were simply identical. The text seems to hold this ambiguity deliberately rather than accidentally, allowing the servant to function at once as a picture of what the whole nation was called to be, and as a single figure whose mission exceeds anything the nation as a whole ever managed to accomplish. The first of these servant passages introduces him with a quietness that stands in deliberate contrast to the world of conquerors and empires that has dominated so much of the book until this point. Here is my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. And then, almost immediately, the passage insists on a method entirely unlike anything Sennacherib or Cyrus or any other ruler in this book has been described using. He will not shout or cry out, or raise his voice in the streets, A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. It is an image built almost entirely out of gentleness, a reed already bent and damaged, so fragile that the smallest additional pressure would finish it off, and a wick already guttering, one breath away from going dark. And the servant is described handling both with such deliberate care that neither is finished off, but is instead, somehow, restored. This same servant is given as a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles, to open eyes that are blind, to free captives from prison, and to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. A mission that stretches, even in this first brief appearance, far beyond the borders of the nation he is elsewhere identified with. The second servant passage deepens the mystery of his identity rather than resolving it. Opening with the servant himself, speaking in the first person, describing his own calling in terms usually reserved for the prophets, "The Lord called me before I was born. From my birth he has made mention of my name." He describes discouragement in nearly the same breath, admitting that he had labored in vain, spent his strength for nothing at all, a confession that sits uneasily beside the confident commissioning that opens the passage, and yet the discouragement is not the last word given to him. "It is too small a thing," the Lord tells him, "for you to be my servant to restore the tribes of Jacob and bring back those of Israel I have kept. I will also make you a light for the Gentiles, that you may bring my salvation to the ends of the earth." Whatever failure the servant feels in himself, the passage insists, does not cancel the scope of what he has been appointed to accomplish, a scope that will eventually include kings rising to their feet and princes bowing down, honoring a servant the world at large would have expected to overlook entirely, one deeply despised, abhorred by the nation, a servant of rulers. The third passage narrows the focus further, and for the first time introduces suffering not as a possibility hovering at the edges of the servant's mission, but as the very substance of his obedience. "The sovereign Lord has given me a well-instructed tongue, to know the word that sustains the weary, wakens me morning by morning, wakens my ear to listen like one being instructed." And then, without transition, the passage moves directly into what that instruction cost him. "I offered my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from mocking and spitting." There is no description here of resistance, no account of the servant defending himself or calling for rescue, only a deliberate, almost startling willingness to absorb an abuse he could apparently have avoided. "Because the sovereign Lord helps me," the passage continues, "I have set my face like flint, and I know I will not be put to shame." A confidence that seems to rest entirely on trust in vindication yet to come, rather than on any relief in the present moment. It is the fourth and final of these passages that reaches the fullest and most disturbing depth of the servant's suffering, and it is also the passage that has drawn, across many centuries of both Jewish and Christian interpretation, the most sustained attention of any single section in the entire book. It opens, unexpectedly, with exaltation rather than suffering. "My servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted, though many were appalled at him. His appearance was so disfigured, beyond that of any man, and his form marred beyond human likeness." The passage then turns to describe how thoroughly this servant would be overlooked and misjudged by those who witnessed his suffering without understanding it. "He grew up before the Lord like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain, and like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. What follows is the passage's central and most staggering claim, a claim that the suffering just described was not merely endured by the servant, but was, in some manner the text insists upon without fully explaining, carried by him on behalf of others. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. The passage is relentless in this substitution, describing the servant as oppressed and afflicted, yet silent, like a lamb led to the slaughter, and like a sheep before its shearers is silent. So he did not open his mouth, taken away by oppression and judgment, cut off from the land of the living for the transgression of the servant's own people. Even his burial is described with an incongruity the passage does not attempt to smooth over. Assigned a grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. The passage closes with a reversal every bit as sudden and startling as the opening exaltation had been, refusing to let the servant's story end in the grave assigned to him. It was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer, and though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. The final image returns to the language of conquest and division of spoils, more commonly used to describe victorious kings. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. A servant who never once raised his voice in the street, who offered his back to those who struck him, who was led like a lamb without protest to a death he did not deserve, is here described dividing spoils among the strong. Precisely the language this book had earlier reserved for the great conquering kings and empires, whose pride it had spent so many chapters humbling. In this single figure, the book's two great and seemingly opposed portraits of power, the conqueror who takes by force and the servant who gives by suffering, are folded into one, and the text offers no further explanation of how that folding is meant to work, only the plain and repeated insistence that it does. The closing chapters of this book turn from the servant's suffering to a question that any exile reading these promises of return would eventually have to face, namely, who, exactly, would be permitted to belong to the restored community once it was finally rebuilt. The answer given is more expansive than a nation freshly returned from captivity might have expected or even wanted. Let no foreigner who has bound himself to the Lord say, "The Lord will surely exclude me from his people," and let no eunuch complain, "I am only a dry tree." Because to the eunuchs who keep the Sabbath and hold fast to the covenant, the promise is a monument and a name better than sons and daughters, an everlasting name that will endure forever. Foreigners who bind themselves to the Lord, who love his name and keep his covenant, are promised joy in his house of prayer. And the passage arrives at a declaration that reaches beyond anything the earlier oracles against foreign nations had prepared the reader to expect. My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. A book that opened with a vision of smoke filling a temple no ordinary worshiper could fully enter, closes its middle sections by insisting that the temple's doors would one day stand open to precisely the outsiders its earlier oracles had so relentlessly judged. Alongside this expansion of who belongs comes an equally sharp correction of what genuine worship actually requires, aimed at a returned or returning community that had apparently begun treating religious observance as a transaction rather than a transformation. "Why have we fasted?" the people are pictured asking, "and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves, and you have not noticed?" The answer refuses to let ritual stand in for righteousness, pointing out that on the very day of their fasting they were exploiting their workers, that their fasting ended in quarreling and strife, and in striking each other with wicked fists. "Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen?" the passage demands instead. "To loose the chains of injustice, to set the oppressed free, to share your food with the hungry, to provide the poor wanderer with shelter when you see the naked, to clothe them, and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood." Only worship reshaped along those lines is promised the result the people had been seeking all along. "Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. And if you do this," the passage promises, "you will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail." The closing chapters also return, with renewed intensity, to the imagery of watchmen first suggested earlier in the book's long central section. "I have posted watchmen on your walls, Jerusalem," the passage says. "They will never be silent day or night. You who call on the Lord, give yourselves no rest, and give him no rest till he establishes Jerusalem and makes her the praise of the earth." This same section describes a highway being built. "Lift up a banner for the nations, remove the stones, prepare the highway for the people." An image echoing the earlier call to prepare a road for the Lord's own arrival, only now applied to the actual physical return of exiles streaming home from every direction, sons from afar and daughters carried on the hip. And into this picture of restoration steps a figure who identifies himself in words that later readers would find impossible to separate from the servant songs that preceded him. "The Spirit of the sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." It is a mission statement built entirely out of release and healing rather than conquest, promising those who mourn a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair, so that they will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor. The book's final chapters do not abandon the theme of judgment entirely, even as they move toward their ultimate vision of restoration, and one passage in particular returns to the language of conquest with an intensity that recalls the earliest oracles against foreign nations, though here the imagery is turned toward God himself acting alone, rather than through any human army. "Who is this coming from Edom?" the passage begins, "with garments stained crimson? Why are your garments red, like those of one treading the winepress?" The answer given is deliberately unsettling. "I trampled the nations in my anger. I poured their blood on the ground. I looked, but there was no one to help, so my own arm achieved salvation for me." This same arm of the Lord, described elsewhere in these closing chapters as not too short to save, nor his ear too dull to hear, becomes the central image binding together the whole final movement of the book, a divine strength that acts when human strength has entirely failed. Whether that failure looks like an empire too proud to be resisted, or a community too weary and divided to save itself. It is against this backdrop of an arm that acts where human effort cannot that the book reaches its final and most sweeping vision, one that pushes past the return from exile, past the rebuilt temple, past even the more immediate restoration the earlier chapters had promised, into an entirely new order of creation itself. "Behold, I will create new heavens and a new earth," the passage declares. and the former things will not be remembered, nor will they come to mind. But be glad and rejoice forever in what I will create, for I will create Jerusalem to be a delight, and its people a joy. The details that follow are almost unbearably tender after everything the book has put both its characters and its readers through. The sound of weeping and crying will be heard in it no more. Never again will there be in it an infant who lives but a few days, or an old man who does not live out his years. They will build houses and dwell in them. They will plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They will not build houses, and others live in them. They will not plant, and others eat. For as the days of a tree, so will be the days of my people. Even creation's ancient hostilities are pictured dissolving entirely in this vision. The wolf and the lamb will feed together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain. An image of peace so complete that predator and prey, the very categories that had structured the natural order since the beginning, simply cease to apply. And yet the book does not permit itself to close on that note of unclouded peace alone, choosing instead to end its final chapter with a sentence that has troubled and sobered readers for as long as this book has been read. As the new heavens and the new earth that I make will endure before me, so will your name and descendants endure from one new moon to another and from one Sabbath to another. All mankind will come and bow down before me, and they will go out and look on the dead bodies of those who rebelled against me. Their worm will not die, nor will their fire be quenched, and they will be loathsome to all mankind. It is a jarring final image to sit beside gardens and vineyards and wolves lying down with lambs, and the book offers no softening transition between the two, no attempt to reconcile the tenderness of one vision with the severity of the other, leaving both to stand together as the last word. A new creation of total peace, existing permanently alongside. A reminder that rebellion against the God who made that peace possible carries a weight this book has never, from its very first vision in the smoke-filled temple, pretended was anything less than absolute. The book itself never tells us how its own prophet died, which is a strange silence given how much attention it pays to the deaths of kings, the fall of cities, and the fates of nations scattered across the earth. Isaiah simply stops appearing in the narrative, his final recorded act being the confirmation to Hezekiah of the added 15 years and the sober warning about Babylon that followed it. And after that, the man who had stood in the smoke of the temple, who had walked through Jerusalem for a season with his shirt and sandals removed as a living warning to the nation, who had met a frightened king at a laundry field and confronted a proud one in his own palace, simply disappears from the page. It is tradition, rather than the book itself, that fills in the end of his story, and the tradition it fills that silence with is a brutal one. According to a strand of Jewish legend preserved outside the main body of Scripture, Isaiah met his death under the reign of King Manasseh, Hezekiah's own son, a king, remembered as one of the most thoroughly wicked rulers Judah ever produced, a man who rebuilt the very high places his father had torn down, who sacrificed his own children in fire, who practiced sorcery and divination, and who filled Jerusalem with innocent blood from one end to the other. The legend holds that Isaiah, fleeing the persecution of this king, hid himself inside the hollow trunk of a tree, and that Manasseh's men, discovering where he had concealed himself, took a wooden saw and cut through the tree with the prophet still inside it, killing him by the same method one might use to fell timber. Whether or not the details of that legend are historically precise, it found its way early into the memory of communities that revered Isaiah, and many scholars have long suspected that a passing reference buried inside the New Testament letter to the Hebrews, describing certain unnamed heroes of faith who were sawed in two, was intended as a veiled acknowledgement of exactly this tradition, a martyrdom so well known among first-century readers that it required no further explanation to be understood. It is a fitting, if unverifiable, end for a man whose entire ministry had been defined by speaking hard truths to kings who did not want to hear them, and there is a bitter symmetry in the tradition that the same office that had once confronted an Ahaz too frightened to trust and comforted a Hezekiah too proud in his own recovery should finally be silenced by a king so given over to violence that even hiding inside living wood offered no protection at all. Whatever became of the man, the book that carries his name did not disappear alongside him, and its influence across the centuries that followed is difficult to overstate. No other prophetic book is quoted more often in the writings that would eventually make up the New Testament, its lines appearing in the mouths of nearly every major figure in that later story. When crowds needed language to describe a voice preparing the way in the wilderness, they reached for Isaiah's own image of a highway leveled through the desert, and applied it directly to a rough prophet in camel's hair, calling the nation to repentance along the banks of the Jordan. When the earliest storytellers of Jesus' birth needed to explain the strangeness of what they claimed had happened, they reached for the sign given so long ago to a frightened and unbelieving king, a virgin conceiving a son to be called Immanuel, God with us, applying words spoken originally into the panic of the Syro-Ephraimite War to a birth that occurred some 700 years later in circumstances Ahaz could never have imagined. When Jesus himself is described standing in a synagogue and being handed a scroll to read aloud, the words placed in his mouth are, "Isaiah's own, the Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor." And the account describes him rolling up the scroll afterward and declaring to the assembled congregation that this scripture had been fulfilled in their hearing that very day. The fourth servant song in particular, with its unbearable image of one pierced for the transgressions of others, crushed for their iniquities, silent as a lamb before its shearers, became for the earliest generations of Jesus' followers the primary lens through which they made sense of a death that had, by every ordinary political and religious measure available to them, looked like total and humiliating defeat. A crucified man was, in the world of that century, a failed man, a criminal, a curse rather than a king. It was to this same servant song, more than to any other single passage in their inherited scriptures, that those early followers turned to argue that apparent defeat and true victory were not, after all, opposites, that a figure despised and rejected, with no beauty or majesty to attract anyone to him, it could still be the very arm of the Lord. The closing chapters of this book had promised would one day achieve salvation when no other help could be found. The book's reach did not stop at controversies over prophecy and fulfillment carried out in synagogues and among religious scholars. It traveled, quite literally, down a desert road between Jerusalem and Gaza in the lap of a foreign official riding home in his chariot, reading this very prophet aloud without any companion to help him understand what he was reading. It was to the fourth servant song specifically, the account of one led like a sheep to the slaughter, silent before his shearer, denied justice, that this Ethiopian treasurer had turned, when a stranger came running alongside his chariot and asked whether he understood what he was reading. "Is the prophet speaking about himself?" the official asked, "or about someone else?" And it was from that exact passage, according to the account, that the stranger began to explain the good news about Jesus, ending in a baptism performed at the edge of whatever water they happened to find along that lonely stretch of road. A prophecy spoken centuries earlier into the anguish of a small, frightened, embattled kingdom had traveled, by that point, far enough to reach a court official from a kingdom near the edge of the known world, still doing exactly what it had always done, refusing to explain itself completely, and yet proving true precisely when its time finally came. It is this quality, more than any other, that seems to hold the whole sprawling book together across its 66 chapters, its temple visions and its water conduits, its Assyrian field commanders and its exiled treasuries, its taunted empires and its comforted exiles, its suffering servant and its new creation. Very little of it explains itself fully at the moment it is spoken. Ahaz was offered a sign he refused to ask for, and it was given to him anyway, resolving only partially within his own lifetime and reaching, by every honest reading, far beyond it. Cyrus was named generations before his birth, summoned by a god he never came to acknowledge. A servant was described, suffering for sins that were not his own, buried among the wicked and the rich alike, and exalted only after that suffering had run its full course. And the prophet who spoke all of it, if the old legend can be trusted at all, was finally silenced inside the hollow of a tree, his voice cut off exactly the way his own book had always insisted. Judgment must eventually fall on those who refuse to hear, even as the very same book had already promised from its opening vision onward. That something always survives the cutting. A stump remains, a remnant returns, a name endures. Whatever the truth of how Isaiah died, the truth of what he spoke did not die with him. And 2,500 years after a young man stood trembling in a temple filled with smoke and the train of a robe too vast for any building to contain, the words he carried out of that room are still being read, still being argued over, still finding their way, however improbably, into the hands of strangers on lonely roads who did not know they were waiting to hear them.